Hey y'all, welcome back to another video. Today I wanted to talk about a framework that has been extremely helpful in my journey into farming, and more broadly, the paradigms that I hold around scarcity and abundance. Before I begin, please make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment, particularly if you've ever encountered this work before, or if something that I share today struck you in particular in maybe shifting your thinking moving forward. So what I'm talking about here is a work known as the 8 Forms of Currency. And this was brought about by Ethan Rowland and Gregory Landau in their work Regenerative Enterprise. I'll make sure to link their website in the description so that you have the opportunity to support their work and download this full ebook that goes very deep into what I'm covering here today. Often when I'm teaching folks how to develop their holistic context within the framework of Alan Savory's work, I bring in the 8 Forms of Currency because I think that they mesh really beautifully together in assessing what resources we have available to us. Well, typically this is in the context of teaching farmers or aspiring farmers or homesteaders. I think that familiarizing yourself with this 8 Forms of Currency is important no matter who you are, no matter what stage of life you're at, or no matter what you're endeavoring to do. Looking at this image that breaks down the 8 Forms of Currency, it's pretty clear to see that in our broader society, financial capital is regarded above all else. Unfortunately, so many of us frame our lives and even our own self-perception in relation to how much money we have. What results out of that is many people and businesses taking advantage of our perceptions of money and wealth and exploiting that to sell expensive things that people don't need to people who can't afford them often, as well as a constant narrative that attempts to convince us that getting more money is a primary source of happiness. While I don't endeavor to dive too deep into any of those broader societal mindsets that we see, I highly recommend the work of E.F. Schumacher, particularly Small is Beautiful, as well as the essays of Wendell Berry, as those have been very impactful in my learning. So despite financial capital being the most highly regarded in our greater society, often at the expense of these other 7 categories, it's in fact just one small piece of the pie of the wealth and resources that may be available to us. When we only frame wealth and poverty in monetary terms, we put ourselves in a paradigm that we simply do not have to follow. And freeing ourselves of this mindset can be one of the most liberating shifts that we can undertake, as it has been in mine. Before starting Wild East, I never endeavored to make a lot of money or frame my day-to-day life within that context, and never had much money because of that. Yet, at the same time, I spent that decade of my life trying to equip myself with as many resources in the other categories as I possibly could. And I think it's largely because of that, and taking stock of the resources outside of money alone that I was gaining, that I never developed a scarcity mindset, even when living within really humble means. Now, I should address the fact that I've certainly lived with a certain level of privilege that has made my experience of developing an abundance mindset perhaps much easier than it is for others, and I acknowledge that. However, I've shared this framework with so many people with so many different socioeconomic backgrounds, races, ethnicities, genders, religions, you name it. And uniformly, the core takeaways from teaching this resonate with everyone. So starting at the top of this list laid out, I like to say that one relationship can often be worth more than all the money one could ever accumulate in their lifetime. Any one of us that's loved another unconditionally are familiar with this experience. How many of you would trade one meaningful relationship, whether that be a child, a parent, a spouse, a mentor, or best friend, for any lump sum of money? Despite them not laying out this list in a hierarchical sense, I think it's fitting that social capital is at the top of the chart. As Thomas Berry, someone who's been very influential in my thinking, who's a philosopher and what's known as an eco-theologian, says at the core of his work, relationships are the primary context of existence. The human-to-human relationships that enrich our lives are worth more than anything we may encounter, in my opinion. Now, material capital is perhaps the most similar to financial capital in our thinking, but unlike money, we can have high-quality material capital or low-quality material capital. Money, at the end of the day, is just money, and it's worth what it's worth. In my experience, taking inventory of my material resources and assessing what I truly value versus what is taking up space has freed up physical and mental clutter. As when I'm honest with myself, it's easy to cull out the lower quality, space-consuming junk that tends to accumulate in households and general spaces of those living in affluent places. I think the fact that you can seemingly accidentally accumulate materials that you don't even value is a phenomena probably unthinkable prior to industrialization. I'm not a proponent necessarily of radical minimalism, but rather what I would call qualityism. And that means, to the extent possible, I strive to keep, thrift, and purchase only items that bring real value into my life and that are made of quality materials that are going to last. Moving through the list, the living capital section may seem a bit esoteric to the non-farmer, but very, very relevant to the daily life of us working with the land and producing abundance, biodiversity, and our very own livelihoods from the land itself. Our living bank account at Wild East includes the biomass of the living plants, soil fertility and organisms, vertebrate diversity, healthy water cycling, and any other functioning ecosystem process. I find great comfort in watching our living bank account and the bank account of this place grow. I know that this system operates independently of the global economic and social institutions that are in place, and those that many of us are concerned over the fragility of. When I make deposits into the living capital of my farm, I believe I'm doing the work of securing a healthy future for myself, for other humans, and all of the present and future non-humans that call this place home. It's my firm belief that an investment in the living capital of a place is never a waste of time or energy. Now, intellectual capital is really the knowledge that we allow ourselves through reading, attending school, courses, workshops, or our own creative outputs. I think that our society values intellectual capital quite highly, as those who have jobs that require expertise or high levels of intellect are often compensated at a higher rate. And deep within, I ask the question, why should any one of our passions be any different? The ability to absorb valuable knowledge and integrate it in your own life, as well as the ability to teach others, is about as human of a quality as I can think of. Mastery, mentorship, and that whole dynamic of the knowledge that we gain and pass on are part of what has allowed us to thrive as a species. Take your knowledge base very seriously and never see a finish line. The learning should never end. While experiential capital is very closely tied to intellectual capital, I believe it differs in that experiential capital is the resource that one builds when they apply their knowledge to their day-to-day lives. I think you can only learn so much from books or the words of others. and transferring theory into sensory experience and learning from triumphs and mistakes is what develops wisdom ultimately. Mastery, in my mind, cannot just come from an academic place. It must come from lived experience. I can imagine for most people looking back on their lives at 80, 90, 100 years old, our experiences and what we take from those experiences are at least as if not more valuable than any other aspect of our lives. I think it's really important to enjoy the process of learning, which includes failure as well as triumph, and not see any of the highs and lows as things to strive for, but as inherent and necessary parts of the learning process in developing mastery in whatever it is you do. Zooming out a bit, they talk about spiritual capital, and I see spiritual capital as our connection to a purpose or a source of meaning outside of ourselves. For me, that's farming. For you, it may look different or it may look the same. It doesn't have to be denominational or religious. For example, most of my deposits into my spiritual bank account are the afternoons I spend watching the clouds roll across the valley, or the very first carrot I pull out of the ground in the spring, watching that seed become food. I think that having a daily practice of acknowledging the spiritual and the miraculous nature of the world that we exist in and developing this sense of the sacred is critical. And in my experience, this above anything else contributes most greatly to happiness, because it's a practice within yourself of developing connection with something greater than yourself. It's not dependent on the state of your relationships. It's not dependent on what you're doing in your day-to-day life. It's not dependent on what other resources you may have at your disposal at that time. And this daily practice of gratitude can bring peace and stillness to any moment in life. And finally, getting to cultural capital. I really love that this framework is bookended by forms of currency that center around human-to-human connections. Cultural capital is similar to relational capital, except it connects us not only to the humans that are there around us today, but those who have come before us and that will come after us. For all of human history, culture has centered around ritual, song and dance, storytelling. These are integral parts, I believe, of what it means to be a human being and finding deep satisfaction and meaning in our daily lives. What are your outlets for developing cultural capital? They often look differently today than they did for the majority of human history, but we still have access to forms of culture that are deeply meaningful. For me, that looks like cooking, music, and ritual practice around the changing of seasons, and are ultimately practices that I center my life around greatly. I believe agriculture, when done with integrity, is a form of culture that inherently brings us closer to the source of life itself. And that's why I think so many of us are drawn to it. So that's just a quick overview of this concept that's been extremely impactful, as I said, in my life. And I think by taking inventory of the resources that you have in each one of these 8 forms, you can develop a more robust understanding of the true wealth available to you. It's easy to get obsessed with financial capital and prioritize it over other vital aspects of living with abundance. My experience using this to frame the way that I view my life has opened my eyes to the abundance that I have available to me. As I said, even in times where the financial side that we all focus on so much was not the focus and was not abundant. It's empowered me to take chances and to believe in myself. I believe that any one of us who take the time to really take stock of all of these resources we have available in our lives will end the practice feeling more wealthy than before, more abundant than before. And that is a powerful place to be operating from. So I encourage you to not just watch this video, not just read Regenerative Enterprise, but to actually take the time to sit down with a notebook and work through this for yourself. And I believe that many of you watching who do that will walk away with a list of resources and wealth that perhaps you hadn't fully seen all at once. So that's it for today's video. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.